Go ahead and get started today. Let's see, how can we do this? So welcome to the second annual Heritage Orchard Conference. We wanted to welcome everyone back that made it to our in-person conference in Sandpoint, Idaho last spring. And also wanted to welcome all the newcomers that are just joining us for their first Orchard Conference and our first webinar of this series. My name is Kyle Nagy, and I'm the Superintendent and Orchard Operations Manager at the University of Idaho's Sandpoint Organic Agriculture Center. Of course, with the whole COVID-19 pandemic going on, we had to make some changes to our plan for this year. We had originally planned to have an in-person conference this fall. We were hoping to have people be able to bring in their apples and ciders so we could do some identification and, more importantly, do some taste testing. But that just wasn't in the cards this year, so we decided to reorganize and make this into a free monthly webinar series. So we're really excited to still be able to hold this event this year. And this is our first webinar for the series, and it will be going on for the next 9 months, all the way through April of 2021. All of our webinars are going to be taking place on the third Wednesday of each month, and that is 10 o'clock Pacific time. So we're going to be covering a variety of topics that should be of interest to most heritage apple enthusiasts, explorers, growers, and researchers. So there should be a topic or two in there that interests everyone. I also wanted to mention that that since we originally sent out our email for registration, we have added the final webinar for April of next year, and that is Bob Canistano of the Felix Gillette Institute. He's going to be presenting perennial fruit plants of the Northern Sierra Gold Rush era. So if you didn't get signed up for that one, I think that should be a really interesting presentation. You can go back to our registration page and get signed up there, and you'll receive the reminder for that. For those of you who are attending their first Zoom webinar, this is going to be a little different than Zoom meetings if you've attended those in the past. The only people that have video and audio capabilities are going to be our panelists here. And we're going to be using the Q&A app, which is a function that should be available at the bottom of your Zoom window. And that's where you can submit questions throughout the presentation to be answered by our experts here. We're going to hopefully stop about halfway through our presentation and do some questions from the first few topics, and then we are going to have another Q&A session at the end of our presentations. Also, a quick disclaimer, all of our committee members here are heritage apple explorers, growers, and researchers, but none of us are particularly tech savvy. So if we do run into any technical issues during the course of our webinar, please bear with us, and we're working to get it sorted out. We have some help from the University of Idaho's IT department, and hopefully they'll be able to sort this out if we do have any issues. Before we get started, I wanted to share a quick story that I read just this morning that would be of interest to a lot of you heritage apple enthusiasts. Those in the Pacific Northwest might have heard and be familiar with this, but the old apple tree, as it's known, in Vancouver, Washington, has died this summer. It's a very unfortunate occasion. This wasn't any ordinary apple tree. This was known as the old apple tree. It was an English greening that was planted in 1826 at Fort Vancouver along the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington. So it lived to be 194 years old before dying this summer. The cause of death was stated as a spiral crack, decay, and old age. At 194, that's understandable. Being the first known apple tree planted in the Pacific Northwest, the old apple tree was considered the matriarch of the Northwest apple industry. So it's definitely a big loss for us out here. Luckily, over the years, hundreds of cuttings have been distributed through the Pacific Northwest thanks to a annual festival that the local community held to celebrate this unique tree. And I just thought that that was an important point to make and an important story for everyone to know about as we begin thinking about the importance of finding, identifying, and preserving these historic varieties. Anyways, without further ado, I thought we'd get right into our first webinar series, or of the series. This month, we are discussing sleuthing for lost apples, lessons from the experts. Our guest panelists today are David Benscoter of the Lost Apple Project based in Spokane, Washington, and John Bunker of the Maine Heritage Orchard in Unity, Maine. David Benscoter is a retired federal law enforcement officer who turned his detective skills from crime to heritage apples of eastern Washington and North Idaho. Since 2012, the Lost Apple Project has rediscovered 23 different apple varieties that were once thought to be lost, including the Nero, the Dickinson, and the Arkansas Beauty. Our other guest presenter is John Bunker, author and apple historian. He started Fedco Trees in 1984 as a cooperative mail order nursery, and he recently released his book, Apples and the Art of Detection, which recounts his 40 years of tracking down, identifying, and preserving these rare varieties. So let's get into it. John, how did you first become interested in finding and preserving these old lost varieties?
Okay, well, can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you well.
Yes.
Okay, so hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Kyle, Richard Uhlmann, Cameron Peace, and all the others that helped make this happen. It's a pleasure to be sharing the stage, or maybe I should say the screen, with Dave, who I've been getting to know over the last few years. Although I love Central Maine, where I live, I wish that we were all out there together in Idaho right now, but that isn't the case. This is my first Zoom talk ever, so please forgive me if it's a bit weird. It inspired me to clean up my act, and I even got a haircut for the first time since pre-COVID yesterday. So hopefully I look very spiffed up. The day, it's bizarre. I'm here in the Palermo library by myself talking to a computer screen. But anyway, here goes. The day after I graduated from college, I moved to a small town in central Maine and called Palermo. And I was very fortunate that that was 1972. I was very fortunate that many of the old trees, the old apple trees, were still here in town. There are still quite a few, but back then, almost 50 years ago, there were many more. The farms were still there, although most of them were not functioning anymore as farms. But the trees were there, and pretty much every farm in town had a small orchard of, call it 6 to 10 trees, some maybe even 20. A couple in town had 100 trees, but those were quite rare. And I, being young and adventurous and always looking for free food, I started to stop at people's yards when I saw the apples scattered on the ground. And they would, I would ask them if I could have them, and invariably they'd say yes, of course, and I would collect the apples. And as I like to say, I thought there were two kinds of apples, red ones and green ones, but I quickly learned that there were actually many more, though I didn't know the names. but I became intrigued by the shapes and the sizes, and especially by all the different colors. One of my jobs early on when I first lived here was working in a small co-op store. And one day, a fellow came in and asked if an older man came in and asked if he could sell some apples. We would sell apples on consignment for him. And we said, sure, of course. And he got out of his truck 2 bushels of these black apples. And he said, these are black Oxfords. And here's my exhibit A. This is the old fashioned, I'm just gonna hold it up. There it is. And I took one look at the apples, and he left, and I bought both bushels in their entirety and brought them home. And that was really my introduction. I would already become interested in the apples and, you know, had started to pick them and so forth, but this really propelled me into wondering about what were these varieties that I was seeing around town and around the county. I began to think of them as a gift to me from the past. Not that I owned them, I had no apple trees of my own, but I felt like someone had done this for me, really for all of us, but I like to personalize it. I felt like they were for me. And I began to think about who were these people, and why did they do this? And I began to think about the future. And I began to think about what was going to happen to these old trees. And I decided that I needed to learn more about them. And I needed to find mentors. And I began to locate older people who would teach me more about the old varieties. And I found several mentors. They have all died since then. But back then, they were my initial key, one of my initial keys into this, the doorway, you might say, that I entered through. And I realized at a certain point that that there was this body of apple varieties that originated in Maine or were grown traditionally in Maine, and that they were dying out. Even the old timers in Palermo, in the town where I live, didn't know the names of many of the varieties, including the ones growing in their yards. Now I realized that this information was dying quickly, and that if someone didn't do something about it, it was going to be gone forever. And I decided that it might as well be me. I realized that I had in front of me, I was pretty young at the time, I had hopefully a lifetime of time, call it a responsibility or call it an opportunity, but it's maybe they're really the flip sides of the same coin. But for whether you call it responsibility or opportunity, I had both. And I decided that this was just going to be something that I would do.
Yeah, that's great. I definitely understand that responsibility towards the apples. We definitely don't want to lose any of these great old varieties just from neglect. David, what set you on the path of apple exploration?
Well, like John, I never foresaw this many years ago. It was something that caught me kind of by surprise. And it was probably close to 10 years ago that I was helping a neighbor, and she asked me to go pick some apples in her orchard. And I grabbed a ladder and I grabbed a bucket and I headed to her orchard. In about 5 minutes, I came back and I said, I can't pick any apples. They're all too high. And I knew how to prune an apple tree, and my dad had taught me how to prune and to graft, and I said I can be back later in the early spring, late winter, and I can start pruning your trees. And I said, probably within 2 or 3 years, you're going to have, a real nice crop. She had probably about 20 different trees, but I could tell they were really old. And that winter, I just got to thinking, it was probably a winter with snow on the ground. I couldn't go outside. I started thinking about those apples. And I called her up and I said, do you know what varieties those are? Because I knew they weren't going to be Fujis and they weren't going to be Galas. And she said, well, I know 2 at the top are yellow transparent. She contacted her brother. He said there were 4 in this one row that were Wealthies, but he didn't know any of the rest. So I just kind of got on my computer, just started Googling Spokane apples and things like that. First thing to pop up was this article about a 20,000 acre orchard about 20 miles from where I lived. That started in 1907. And I thought, and it was called the world's largest orchard, Arcadia. I thought, how on earth do I not know about this? The world's largest orchard. And so I started contacting people. I went, there's still trees up there, but I just thought it was fascinating, and it got me really interested in apples. And then pardon me? Oh, and then I got interested in other apples in eastern Washington. There's a fellow down just about 70 miles south of Spokane in Colfax, Washington. His name was George Rudy, and he was a nurseryman. And he also discovered a couple varieties. And so one day I was doing some research on George, and in the same newspaper, this was a newspaper in the early 1900s, I read the article on Rudy, and then I happened to notice there was also an article on the state, or excuse me, the county fair. And the county fair said they listed their prizes. I thought, oh, well, that's cool. If they list a prize for an apple, that would be really cool. I had no idea how they did awarded their prizes. So I'm going to show you one picture of an article from from an edition of the county paper down there. And if you notice where I've got those arrows, I started looking at those apples. I recognized a lot of the names, but there was a lot of names I didn't recognize. And what I later found was I had purchased the book. I purchased John Bunker's book about the Palermo apples, and his first book. I'd also purchased Lee Calhoun's book, which was Old Southern Apples. So I was aware that there were apples that were actually lost in America. And since I saw these names that I didn't recognize, I started writing them down, and I thought, well, I'll go compare them with Lee Calhoun's list of names. And wrote them down, and then compared it to Calhoun's book, and sure enough, there were 3 apples. It might even have been 4, but at least 3 apples growing in Whitman County here in eastern Washington that were considered lost, but had grown here at one time. And it was just at that moment, I just got goosebumps, because I knew, and I thought I was probably the only person who knew that there were lost apples, or possibly lost apples, in eastern Washington. And I had to decide what I wanted to do about that.
Yeah, sounds like you guys had different paths to get to the same conclusion of seeing the value of these old varieties and wanting to or having that responsibility to help preserve them. So David, what does your process look like? How do you find, or how do you go about finding these lost varieties?
Well, the process has kind of changed through the years. At first, with these apples, and I'll take these off the screen. Let's see.
I think that's already down. You're good to go.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. When I realized that these 3 apples could possibly be in eastern Washington, I started doing a little bit more research. I got all the newspapers from this early 1900s, Colfax Gazette, and found out the Walbridge had been submitted 6 times or by 6 different people in Whitman County. The Langford and another apple had only been submitted by a couple different people. But there was one person who'd actually submitted both apples. And so I started going through plat maps at the county. And luckily they had an 1895 plat map, they had a 1910 plat map, but no other early plat maps. And so I started going through the plat maps, and they weren't nearly as populated at that time as they are now. So finding a person was not like an impossible task. And most of the people, at least in the 1800s, or a lot of them, were still on their 160-acre homesteads. And I found a fellow who had a Walbridge and a Langford. And his name was Uhlmann. And I ended up finding his great nephew, I think it was. And Mr. Uhlmann had a heart transplant about a month before, but he was willing to take me out. He took me out on this road and pointed way up on a hill, and he said, "That's the Uhlmann homestead up there." So I got permission and tracked it. Must have been 3/4 of a mile, and sure enough, there were still apple trees out there. There were plum trees. There were cherry trees. The homestead was now the roof had collapsed, and animals were making it their home. The bottom line is I didn't have any luck out there. I found a couple other home sites, but then I kind of changed my method. And the method I first started out or the second method was to go around the county, and I thought, I'm going to just try to find the Walbridge, because the Walbridge had the most people growing it. Plus, it had a unique look to it. The Walbridge is also known as the Edgar Red Streak. So it was a red apple, but it had these dark maroon streaks on it. I'll just look for every apple I can find with those characteristics. And so I would drive around. If I saw somebody who had some old apple trees, I'd stop and ask them if I could pick their apples, and they said sure. And and at that time, I contacted Joni Cooper and Sean Shepard. And Joni and Sean are now part of the Temperate Orchard Conservancy in Oregon, where they conserve they've got like 4,500 plus varieties of apples down there and in conservation. And they also, at that time, were working with the Home Orchard Society. Well, and they were apple identification experts. So I contacted them. I said, I'm gonna, I think, have about 3 or 4 bags of apples. Would you guys be willing to take a look at them? I think they might be the Walbridge. They said, sure. So I found these 3 or 4 bags of red apples that I thought might be the Walbridge. And just before I was gonna turn it in, I found, or I was driving by a water pump in Colfax, and it was so this tree was kind of partially on the land of the water pump, and it was the weirdest looking apple I'd ever seen. To me, it had corners on it, and I pulled over and started picking some of the apples, and they were delicious. And I had no idea what this apple is, so I picked a bunch of those, put them in a bag, mailed them off to Joni and Sean. And in a couple of weeks, I got a response, and they said, well, first of all, those 2 or 3 bags are not Walbridge, but that one apple that you found with the corners on it is an apple called the Fall Geniting. And so I quickly started going through directories. There's a fellow at that time named Nick Botner down in Oregon, and there's government agencies and personal orchards and things like that. And I thought, oh boy, I got a lost apple. And then I called John Bunker, and that darn John Bunker had found that apple the year before. Can you believe that? But you know what? That gave me, oh my goodness, that gave me just a huge, pump up, because I knew it could be done now. And so ever since then, we've kind of made it, I say we, our committee, the Lost Apple Project Committee, we've tried to, as the years go by, we try to get our accomplishments in some kind of newspaper or some kind of media, because we get just a ton of leads to old apple trees through media leads. And right now, I'm mostly picking apples with E.J. Brandt, and EJ handles most of Idaho, and I handle most of Washington. And we just track down all these leads that people send to us.
Yeah, just in the process of getting everyone registered for this event, we've gotten quite a few tips on people that are interested in having some apples identified in their areas. So
that's great.
We'll be adding to our list here soon.
All right.
John, how about you? Is your process similar to David's, or are you coming at it from a different angle?
Well, I think that there's a lot of similarities between what Dave and I do. What I do, I think of as I track down, identify. I'm trying to track down, identify, and preserve rare apples. That's what I say I do. And I can break it down into two different processes. Sometimes I have a name, but I have no apple. And I should have been an FBI. I should have worked with Dave on the FBI. I think we would have made a good team. When I have the name but no apple, then it's like a missing person or a missing apple. Other times I've got the apple but no name, and then it's a case of lost identity. So they're two really different processes, and sometimes they intersect, but that's pretty much what I'm trying to do. Now, I do it, what I really want to do is I want you, whoever you are, to bring me your apples. And my focus has been primarily or almost exclusively Maine. Of course, I've met a lot of people all around the country and even around the world that do this, but I focused on Maine, not because I think Maine is the best place, even though it is the best place, but I do it because I want to focus, and I feel like what we need are a lot of fruit explorers out there in every state that has apples or peaches or whatever. But anyway, so I do a lot of traveling of old roads. I also read a lot of agricultural history. And I put myself out there in the public so that people can see what I do, and then they will bring their apples to me if they know that I'm there. If they don't know that I'm there, then they aren't going to do it. I could drive down the same road 1,000 times and the old apple tree is behind the barn, so I'll never see it. What I need somebody to say, you got to look behind the barn or down this old driveway that you've never been down or whatever. So I give talks to historical societies and garden clubs and at agricultural fairs, wherever I can, sometimes to large groups, sometimes to only half a dozen people. I attend lots of events, and usually when I do, I bring a display of apples. Sometimes the display can be 200 or 300 varieties. And if you put them out there, people see them, they love it. They come over and they just want to know more, and then they want to tell you about their old tree. I also do apple identifications, primarily for Mainers, but I do them for free. And I do them for free, even though it's incredibly time consuming, because I want people to send them to me or bring them to me. And if I charge something, then my guess is that a bunch of people who have really rare stuff would just not do it. and it is time consuming and it is expensive, but it seems like if we're going to do it, we have, this is what we have to do. I also years ago came up with the idea, this also is from my past life as an FBI agent, which is fictitious, but anyway, I'm making these wanted posters. So I made these wanted posters of different apples that were grown in Maine traditionally, because I would read these old ag yearbooks and find them and so forth. And then I brought them to the Common Ground Fair, which is the big ag fair in Maine that I go to every year. And lo and behold, a few days after the fair, somebody called me and said, I know where that farm is, where the Marlboro, I was one of the apples I was looking for, called Marlboro, which is a local apple in Maine. I know where it is. I know where the farm is. She didn't know where the apple was, but she knew where the farm was. So she went and made a map of the farm and sent me apples from every tree on the farm. I mean, it was incredible. And eventually we did find the Marlboro apple at that farm. I also feel like I need to immerse myself in apples and learn about them. So I make a lot of single variety pies, a lot of single variety sauce. I make a lot of cider. I drink a lot of cider. That's very important. And I also recognize that I need to spend a lot of time alone working on this, but that oddly enough, and sort of paradoxically, I can't do it without the help, assistance, help, guidance, cooperation with hundreds of other people. So people sometimes ask me, how many apples have you found or whatever, and I think that here in Maine we have, or I have helped to save many varieties, maybe over 100 or whatever. I don't keep track, but I don't think any of them I could have done it without just huge amounts of help from many people. So it's a one of the, maybe called the most wonderful things about doing this apple sleuthing, is that it connects you not only with plants and with trees and with history, but also connects you with many, many people everywhere.
Yeah, yep, and I think we have a lot of those people here today.
Yeah, it's great.
Well, I'm glad you touched on your wanted posters in Maine. We had someone that registered for the event had asked if John was going to talk about his wanted posters, so I'm glad you got to cover that.
Good.
We're going to take a quick break from the presentation and look at some of the questions that we have had submitted through the Q&A app. First one's for David. This is from Don Ricks. He said that you guys met at Piper's Orchard and that those trees are 130 years old. And the Yakima Reservation has trees planted in the 1870s. Do you know of any other old apple trees in the Pacific Northwest now that the old apple tree in Vancouver is gone?
Yes. From the many emails that I've received, there's a ton of emails I've received from the Puget Sound area on the islands in Puget Sound and just surrounding Puget Sound. There's a lot of there's a lot of interest in Oregon, basically mainly south of Portland, but even in the northeast corner of Oregon. And then, of course, Eastern Washington, I get a lot of leads too. And then we actually have a sister project down in Boise, and they're getting a lot of leads to apples down there. So yeah, there are old orchards just everywhere.
Yeah, and we're tasked with finding them all.
That's right.
All right, we have another question from Sabina. Are there potential volunteer opportunities at either the Lost Apple Project or at the Maine Heritage Orchard? John, do you have any opportunities over there?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Of course, can you even go there now? But we'll stay away from COVID for the moment. But yes, we have, what we've done through Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners with our Maine Heritage Orchard and the work that I've been doing, and a number of others who work closely with me around the state. Primarily, we do have a staff of 2 at our orchard site who take care of the orchard and do a lot of the work. But we've really relied heavily on ourselves as volunteers and on others. And for those of you who live in Maine or New England, or want to come from other parts of the country and come volunteer with us, yes, you can reach us through MOFGA. If you just Google MOFGA or mainheritageorchard.org or MOFGA.org, you'll find a way to connect to the Maine Heritage Orchard. So yes, it's all about volunteering for sure.
How about you, David? Are there opportunities for volunteers at the Lost Apple Project?
Yes, absolutely. We always need feet on the ground to go find these orchards. So, and there's, and not just that, there's always stuff to do, whether it be sending out apples or sending out thank you notes. There's always stuff to do.
Excellent. We have a question from Adam. Do you ever contemplate the similarities between the reclamation of lost apples and the discovery of new ones? The later process is the ultimate genesis of the former, and it seems that same territory are presently ripe for both to occur. So what are your guys' thoughts on reclamation of old varieties versus the discovery of new varieties?
Well, I mean, I'm all for it. I love the new varieties, and the old varieties that we found. Very few of them would I consider as competition to the new varieties, but there are several that I think could actually be competitors and or at least if they were in a breeding program could help out. I'll give you an example. The Gold Ridge, which we found this last fall and was identified by the Temperate Orchard Conservancy. That was an apple that was created by Luther Burbank down in California and then had just disappeared. But all the old writings about it indicate that it is resistant to disease, and plus it's a great tasting apple. And I forget, but there's another apple that also has. Well, I'll give you another example. Seri Sinap that was found this last summer by one of our committee people, E.J. Brandt, and that apple has some very interesting qualities to it. For one, it's a summer apple that is a good keeper. That is like unheard of. So, and there's some other apples too that have really interesting benefits, qualities, and I think would be good for a breeding program possibly.
Do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Sure. Yeah. We grow on our farm. We grow apples from seed every year, and I love growing apples from seed. Some people say, or I always heard, which is why I didn't do it sooner, that you have to grow 30,000 apples from seed in order to get one that's any good, and they're like our children. I love every one, and every year a few more fruit for the first time, and it's just like, it is so fun. So I would suggest that everyone out there plant a few apples from seed every year. And if you can, you don't need to breed them, but you can if you want. But you can pick seeds from your favorite varieties, and then you know one of the parents. Yes, we sit in the middle. In the past are the old seedlings, some of which are still around, and the apple varieties. And in the future are the seedlings. They're the ones that we plant, or the ones that are planted by the deer and the raccoons and the porcupines. And they're the ones that they are the ones using the genetics of really of the old varieties. So anyway, yes, absolutely, it's a great thing to do, and it's the future. It's a big part of the future are the seedlings, and we should all be doing it. So yeah, it's great.
Great advice. Let's see, we have another question from Tucker and Beatty. And they're wondering, how does one go about having an apple source checked out? Can you just submit photos and apple samples? What's the best way for you, David?
For me, it would probably be to send me an email. If the email is, if I say this too fast, then just message me on the Lost Apple Project. I'll tell you what, let's just Lost Apple Project, and then message me from that with your email address, and I'll get back to you.
How about you, John? What's the best way to submit something for test or for identification?
The best way is either you could send me an email at John, John, at Mofga, MOFGA.org, or you can go to our website, which we have our own website where we do a lot of work, which is outonalimapples.com. And that would get you started.
Excellent. We have a question from Jay Heisey. He's wondering if these sessions will be available online later. And yes, these webinars are being recorded, and they will be posted to our webpage probably within a few days after the webinars have concluded. So if you missed the beginning, you'll be able to catch back up in a few days here. We have another question from Sean. Do you have any tips for telling the difference between a good lead on potential lost varieties and those that are well-intentioned but unhelpful leads that will send you to their Macintosh tree?
You know, the only thing that I would say is that I've learned to weed out the good leads from the bad. Are the question, have you actually taken a bite of the apple? And it's surprising how many people don't actually taste the apple before they want to send it in. And I tell them that, first of all, the homesteaders, we're not going to plant bad tasting apple, and then it's also going to tell you where the apple is ripe. So that would be the main thing before I'm contacted.
Yeah,
John, do you have any way to weed out the Macintosh varieties?
No, they just come.
All right, well, we have some more questions, but I think we'll get back into our presentation, and we'll get to the rest of these questions during our final Q&A session. So let's see, John, why do you think people should care about these old lost varieties? Don't we have enough varieties of apples already?
Yeah, no, we don't. When I first got into it, I didn't really need a reason. I just loved doing it. I loved the colors, the shapes, the sizes, the flavors. I loved climbing the trees. I loved the old trees. I loved visiting old timers. It was just fun. And I didn't know why I thought it was important. I just felt compelled to do it. And I had one or two friends that were doing it, but for the most part, it was pretty much a solitary activity. I was a member of NAFIX, so I got some support, we'll say, by reading that. But I would attend Pomological Society meetings because those were the only apple people I knew. And they were commercial growers, many of whom now, much later, many years later, their successors have become my friends. But back then, when the subject of heirloom apples came up, most of them dismissed them and said, you know, they really weren't much good and we should just let them go, and the modern apples are the better ones. And it just didn't make sense to me. These people who planted and cared for and grafted and these trees for generations, they were smart farmers. And there had to be another reason. There had to be a reason why this happened. It couldn't be that they were just dumb and grew bad apples. And then I got I had an idea one day, which was that I have a friend who I worked with who was a chef, and I asked him to teach me how to make a passable pie, and which he did. And I didn't want it to be fancy. I just wanted it to be a plain crust that wouldn't detract from the apples. And I wanted to make a pie. And I took one of these apples that really didn't taste very good, fresh, and I made it into a pie. I can't remember which one it was. And it was really good. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So then I started making single variety pies with every apple I came upon. And then I got the idea that maybe I should be making sauce with these apples. So I started making single variety applesauce with these weird old varieties that I would find. And I wouldn't make a vat of applesauce. I'd make a little saucepan of 3 or 4 apples. And some of them were fabulous. And they cooked in 2 or 3 minutes. And they were this creamy, delicious sauce that required no cinnamon or nutmeg or sugar or anything. And then I started to think, you know, I think I'm onto something. And I thought about the fact that in Maine and in much of rural America, lunchtime, what we call lunchtime now, the noonday meal, used to be called dinner. And most people lived and worked at home, and their big meal was in the middle of the day, and they ate apples, and they did not eat them raw. They did occasionally, or as the English say, with a knife, but they ate them cooked, and they ate them cooked in many different ways, baked and sauce and pies and butter cake and bread and cider and everything else. And these apples, I realized, or I've come to decide to believe, were never intended to be eaten raw. If you want the best sauce apples, the best pie apples, the apples for baking, the apples for cider, you're not going to find them in the grocery store. You're not going to find them in the dessert apples of today. Those apples, though many of them do taste good, I admit, are really sort of junk when it comes to doing all the different things that you can do with an apple. There are no breeding programs nowadays for pie apples or sauce apples, or, you know, there are some people out there trying to find good cider apples. That's really excellent. But for the most part, the breeding is all about the dessert fruit. You can eat a lot more apples if you cook them. I make applesauce every day from early September to late May or early June. And I don't make a vat. I make just a little bit and put it in my oatmeal. Also, there is the percentage, the genus of Malus, which is the apple, is an immense genus with huge diversity. The apples that you can get in the grocery store represent a tiny fraction of that genetic diversity. Even though now there are more and more varieties showing up, it's still a very small percentage of the genetics. We need a larger, we need to take advantage of that diversity in our breeding and in our growing. We should be growing many different kinds of apples, many different species of apples in our orchards, and they all have interesting uses. So we need that. The old varieties, to go back to the old ones, many of the trees that I find are easily 100 years old. Many of them are 150. Some of them are 200 years old. These varieties have been through everything. They've been through severe test winters of abnormally warm falls followed by terribly cold winters. They've been through disease. They've been through pests. They've been through everything, and they're still doing well many, in some cases, generations later. So they have stood the test of time, I guess you could say. So those are some of the reasons. Now, recently, I don't know, in the last year or so, there was an article about or book review or something about a woman who had written a book about a chair, and the chair was in a museum, and the chair, when people came by the chair would look at the people longingly and wish that someone would come sit in the chair again, because no one had sat in the chair for 500 years since it was in, Louis XIV's castle or something. Well, we can, when we eat one of these apples, a Baldwin or a Roxbury Russet or this English Greening or whatever, we are not only seeing or observing what it is that people had years and years ago, we're eating the same fruit. So it's like time traveling. We get to go back in time and be part of what was going on hundreds of years ago. It is our connection to our past, and we are all part of the place in which we live. We might have lived in Boise, Idaho, or Palermo, Maine, or Eastern Washington for a month or a year, or maybe for many generations. Still, it's our place wherever we are. And the agricultural history connects us with that place. So it roots us in our past. As we think about the future of agriculture, we must be looking at what was going on in the past and taking the best of the past and incorporating it into our vision for what agriculture is going to be in the future. And I believe that these old apples play an important role in many ways. One of the questioners was asking about seedlings. Maybe some of these seedlings won't be known 100 years from now, but their progeny should be, because they hold in them the genetics of what, just like, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, we won't be here, but they will be here, and it will be our genetics, our descendants, that lead us into the future.
I think you made some really good points in there, John, and I can guarantee I'm going to be thinking about being a time traveler next time I'm out walking in our orchard. David, what do you think? What do you think is the importance of preserving these lost varieties?
Well, I'll tell you, I mentioned before how, I looked at that one newspaper article that listed the fair varieties, and it was, and as soon as I saw the names of the apples, I had a suspicion that there might be lost apples in Eastern Washington. And then when I compared them and knew there were lost apples in Eastern Washington, it was just like I got goosebumps at that time. And I knew that that John Bunker, that Lee Calhoun, that Tom Burford and others were all along the East Coast and had labored for years looking for lost varieties. And I knew that I was the only person that, at least in my part of the country, Eastern Washington, that knew there were lost apple varieties or possibly lost apple varieties in this area. And it just, man, I just thought I had to think about it for a few minutes, because I knew that if I could do one of two things. I could just close the book and pretend I didn't look at it, or I could actually do something towards finding these lost varieties. And I just felt a tremendous sense of responsibility, thinking that, okay, I've got this, I'm the only one that knows this. I can either just hide it under a bushel or actually do something about it. But if I do something about it, it's probably going to take a lot of hours, because I looked at these men who had done this before, and it wasn't just a part-time thing. It was their life. And so I gave it a try. And to me, the most important part about this, and I get this from the talks that I do, is really not about the apples themselves, but is about the history that goes along. And I will give talks to civic groups and things like that. And oftentimes my audience has members that are over 70, 80 years old. And as I talk about these old apples, I can just almost see it in their eye that they're going back in time, and they're sitting at their mom's table in her kitchen, eating apples with their mom, and apples they haven't tasted in 50, 60, 70 years. And it's the great joy that those memories bring back to them. And so I just think from that, I look for those apples to bring some of those memories back.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it as well. I think it might have been Dr. Steve Miller from the University of Wyoming at last year's in-person Heritage Orchard Conference, who said that in his apple exploration, he had located many varieties that the family know as grandma's favorite. So I'm sure there's a grandma's favorite on just about every old homestead orchard out there. So David, what are some of the lessons that you've learned over your years of apple exploration, and what kind of advice would you give to people who are interested in doing this kind of work in their own area?
Well, the main lesson that we learned in doing, and I use we as in myself, the Lost Apple Project, and Joni Cooper, Sean Shepard, who are the Apple ID people, is that when we go out to orchards, we need to map them, and that we need to attach GPS coordinates to each tree. It's very easy to go out and find a red apple in an orchard in October, but if one of those red apples from one of these orchards has not had GPS coordinates attached to it, and Sean and Joni tell me that there's a lost variety in that orchard, and what tree is it? Once they lose their apples, every tree looks the same. So we make maps of every orchard that we go to, and we attach GPS coordinates to each tree. And we use those GPS coordinates also as identifiers to the apples. But yeah, the first couple of years were a little rough, because until we got our system down, it was sometimes difficult to go back to trees that were possible lost varieties. And what was the second part of your question?
Do you have any tips for people who are just getting started and looking for lost apples in their communities?
I would say just go do it. Just start asking, people, and yeah, there are books out there. John has a book. Lee Calhoun's book is outstanding. Dan Bussey has a 7 volume set of books that is pretty cheap actually right now. And you can learn all about lost varieties and then go out and try some. Some people have apple presses, make some cider. I think people, just go wherever you are, go out and eat old apples.
How about you, John? Are there any lessons that stick out to you that you've learned over the years, or tips that you'd want to give to people just beginning?
Well, I thought I would mention one of my favorite film documentaries. So it's called In Good Time, and it's about a pianist that some of you know, Mary McPartland, who was on NPR for many years. So she died a few years ago. And in the film, she's asked what makes a good jazz musician or something like that. And she says 4 things. One is you have to be able to play in any key. The second is you have to be able to improvise. The third is you need to swing. And the fourth thing is you need to have a sense of humor. And as far as the first thing, play in any key, I have found that doing this has made me at least some version of I have to be a detective, a scientist, a historian, a chef, an artist, and even an orchardist. So when I'm good at it, if I am good at it, or the better I am at it, or whatever, it's because I have to do or get to do all these different things. One of my mentors is Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock says to Watson repeatedly, "You see, but you don't observe." And so I feel like I have had to teach myself, and I'm still always learning, how to observe, how to listen closely, because people tell you things and all of a sudden, if you're not paying attention, you miss some really important thing about an old apple or where something is or whatever. You need to be able to read really closely. Sometimes I skim, but I have to know that sometimes I have to read the minutia over and over again, because there could be some little clue in what I read about the locality of an old apple or its history or where I might find it or whatever. I also have had to learn to speak up and put myself out there in front of people. And for some people who are shy, and I might not look shy, but I'm shy too, you just got to put yourself out there in front of people, or they're not going to know. And very, very quickly, there's another story about music where they were asking somebody, and I don't remember who it was, some famous saxophonist, maybe it was John Coltrane, how he got into music. And he said that he was walking down the street with his mother, and he looked in the window of the music store, and he saw a saxophone, and he pointed at it and he said, that's it. And so I feel like by doing what we do, we're holding the saxophone up to the window and showing people, and that's what we need to do. And the people will see, hopefully they won't see the apples, and they won't see the history, and they won't see the beauty and the importance in what we're doing if we don't put it out there. So we have to put it out there, all of us. I also have had to teach myself, and you will too, to tell the difference between a seedling and a grafted tree. And that is almost number one. And especially in a place like Maine, where there are tens of thousands of seedling trees. They're wonderful, they're fun, I love them. I love to go exploring for seedlings, but they don't have names. unless you name them. So if you're trying to identify an apple and it's a seedling, you're, barking up the wrong tree, I guess. It's also important to learn how to age trees. That's very difficult to do because most old trees are hollow. So what I do is when somebody says to me, my great-grandfather planted these trees in 1910, I stare at them and I think, okay, there's a tree that's 110 years old. Now, they aren't all going to look like that, but if you grow trees and you watch them and you notice how they age, and if you get, if you pay attention when you go to old orchards and you learn what different trees look like, that really helps, because when you're identifying a tree that was planted around 1900, it may well be certain varieties and it cannot be other varieties. So by knowing the age of the orchard, the age of the trees, that really helps. You also I needed to learn the parts of the apple. Learn the interior parts, learn the exterior parts, learn what the calyx is and what the cavity and the basin and all that stuff. You just need to know the names. That's very important. Most important, I think, is to learn to taste and spit. So many people go fruit exploring with me and they're eating and they're eating and they're eating. And then after a while, I can see that they're starting to look green because they've been eating so many apples. And it's not very, polite, I guess you might say, but you gotta just taste and spit, even if you sort of, kind of hide it and toss it away. And if you do taste and spit, you can taste dozens of apples in a day. My own current challenges, and I really think that I have 3 of them. One is, and it was interesting what you said, Kyle, about the death of the old apple tree, the old English greening, that the last big period of diverse planting in the US was post-Civil War, before 1900. Those trees are now approaching 150 years old. The trees planted prior to the Civil War are now approaching 200. Apple trees can live to be more than 200 years old. I've seen some that have been documented, but not often. So what we're facing now is we're facing the death, the inevitable death, not because of anything except just old age. We're facing the inevitable death of many varieties that we have yet to, call it, rediscover or find. So it's really important that we get out there now and find those. They're still there. Many of these old varieties, they're still there. We just haven't found them. They are there. We need to find them now before they're gone. That's the number one challenge for me. The number 2 is to continue to go deeply into agricultural history and to think about what was going on, what were the benefits, if there were any, of the small diversified agricultural model that existed in the US prior to the Civil War. What can we learn as a people about the future of agriculture? If we're going to have an agriculture in the 21st century, what can we learn from the past in terms of apples, in terms of everything about past agriculture? We need to know that so that we can intelligently move into the future of agriculture. And lastly, I would say my other challenge, my third challenge, is to make myself available to all people who are who are interested in this, and especially to make myself available to young people who might benefit from contact with me and with Dave and with others, with Dan Bussey, with Jude and Addie, with Sean and Joni, with people all over the country who are doing this. We need to connect with the young people. We got to have mentors And we may not ever live up to the bar set by our mentors, but we're all there is. So we need to be there for the young people who are going to follow us.
Well,
And,
as a
in other words, play in every key, improvise, swing, and have a sense of humor every day.
Well, as a somewhat younger generation of Apple enthusiasts, I can definitely say that you two are surpassing the bar of what we're looking for mentors in heritage apples. So let's move on and see if we can cover some of the questions that we got through the Q&A session. Let's see. Has there been any thought into having a heritage orchard set up as a national sharing network to distribute scions to each other in order to act as backups and ensure specific varieties continue on? I know this is something that the Heritage Orchard Committee has discussed as being a real priority for us. But Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just in the past year, Washington State University has committed to planting a heritage orchard, and they've got about 100 trees already grafted. The ultimate goal is to have all the trees that were being grown in this area grafted onto rootstock and to be in this orchard. When we first started out, the number of trees we had was about 250 that had been identified. It's now, I'm sure, over 300, and we have the specifically named 40 varieties of these as lost varieties that we're still looking for. So there'll be at least 40 spots empty until those can be located.
Yeah, and also the work that they're doing over at Temperate Orchard Conservancy acts as a big backup source for a lot of these varieties as well. Let's see. Can you give any examples of historic apple projects that involve multiple partners like universities, nonprofits, and farms? My first thought is what we have going on right now. This is a cooperative effort by several universities, including University of Idaho, Washington State University. We have Wyoming, University of Wyoming, and there's others that are becoming involved as well. We have nonprofits like the Lost Apple Project, and we also have producers such as Nikki Conley at Athol Orchards in Athol, Idaho. So we're trying to put together some of these partners so that we can pursue some of these projects to preserve these heritage apples. Do you guys know of any other projects that are working cooperatively like that?
Well, I think that no entity can do this work alone. I know that sometimes the USDA in Geneva, the collection there, can be overwhelmed with requests for scionwood. They want to provide scionwood for researchers and for many people like those of us at this conference, but their funding is limited. A number of us, and Kyle put it well, this conference is about cooperation and collaboration. We need to have, I think, smaller collections all around the country that are led, organized, directed by local people who are working together with others around the country, both governmental and NGOs, and with people all around the world, so that we can find the funding to make it happen, and that no one has to feel like they have to do it all, and so that the rarest material is being grown in multiple locations. Some of that work can be done by organizations like in the East. We have MOFGA, we have Tower Hill Botanic Gardens in Massachusetts, Old Sturbridge Village. There's a number of organizations that are attempting to do this and doing a good job, and there's many private collectors that are doing a good job. But we need everybody, and we need to foster and commit ourselves to ever better, if that's a word, collaboration with each other.
Excellent. Dave, what are some of the resources that you would suggest people have access to if they're interested in getting into identifying and searching for these old apples?
Well, I'll tell you, but besides the books that I mentioned, a lot of the old apple books that were written in the 1800s and early 1900s are available. They're out of copyright, so you can download them right off the internet. Apples of New York is a must-have, and that was printed in the early 1900s. Let's see, the nomenclature of the apple, John?
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, there's several other books that are slipping my mind right now. But another really good place to go is to biodiversity.com. And if you go there and start looking for catalogs, nursery catalogs in your area, those can be really valuable. I'm going to click on one here. Okay, yeah, this was one that I found just a few years ago. I'd actually been looking for apples in Eastern Washington for several years, and this pops up on one of my searches, and it had been uploaded to the internet by the Department of Agriculture, and it turns out this is Vinyl Nursery in Clarkston, Washington, and that's about 150 miles from Spokane. And the nursery actually was relocated from Oakdale, Washington, which is also in Eastern Washington, and has 145 varieties listed in it, many lost varieties. Just recently, I became aware that there were nursery agents, and nursery agents were just basically people that went out on, you have to kind of imagine this. This was back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They didn't have cars. So these nursery agents would take off down the road with just a big catalog of color paintings, and they'd go from homestead to homestead and show what the nursery could offer. And I found that a couple of Oregon nurseries actually had nursery agents in Lewiston, Idaho, which is right across the river from Clarkston, Idaho. And good grief, there's I think we found maybe 15 more lost apples that we know are growing in this part of the country just from those catalogs.
Wow, well, lot still to find out there.
Yep.
One book that Dave mentioned earlier is the new illustrated history of the apple in United States and Canada. That is Dan Bussey's book, 7-volume book, and Dave mentioned that it's very reasonably priced. It is extremely reasonably priced, and I don't think they're going to reprint it. And I highly recommend it for any one of you who have not gotten yourself a copy so far. It has about 16,000 descriptions of different varieties, and also has several thousand of the historic USDA watercolors of apples. And it's really just a phenomenal book, and or set, and really important important for everyone to have. So.
Yep, and Dan Bussey is actually going to be our presenter for our December 16th webinar. So definitely gonna want to catch that one. That should be a good one. Let's see, some more questions. John, what's the oldest tree you have found, and how large was it?
Well, unfortunately, I don't know what is the oldest tree I've found, because they are hollow, and so you really can't know. But the oldest tree that I've found that has a date attached to it is one in Hallowell, Maine, which is in central Maine near Augusta. Augusta's the capital. Hallowell is an old town on the Kennebec River just below Augusta. And in Hallowell is a place called the Vaughn Estate, where the Vaughn family lived and farmed, and they're still there, the family, and they kept records, and they have a tree of a black Oxford that I showed a little painting of earlier, which is documented to have been planted in, and now I forget the year, I think it was 1799 or so. And so that would make it now about 220. I've been to the tree many times. In fact, I was just there about a month ago getting leaves, which we just sent to Pullman, Washington, to Cameron Peace, who is going to do a DNA fingerprint of it. The tree is not very big. It has, the top broke off probably 120 years ago, and it's bent over so that it's folded in half, it's turned inside out, it lays on the ground, and then it sprouts up again, and every other year it produces 5 to 10 bushels of apples. So it's a remarkable tree, but not very big, because of just the way apples deal with age, I guess you might say. So
yeah, that tree has been through a lot.
I think probably are in the vicinity of 200, but then it's just me guessing. Yeah. Actually, I will say there's one other tree that I should mention, which is a tree in New Sharon, Maine, which is in Franklin County, which I visited for the first time about 6 or 7 years ago. And some people asked me to come. They seem like nice people. They asked me to come look at their trees. I said, sure, I'll come, So I went, and we were looking at their old trees. And then the fellow said, well, let's go up and look at a tree up on the hill here. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. So we went up, and it was a Tolman Sweet, which is the old Massachusetts variety, which was grown in Maine, one of the earlier varieties to be grafted in Maine. And the tree is just, it's immense. It is so big and so hollow that about half the trunk is gone. So it's like it's like one of those shells that you can sing from in the park. It's you can get 3 or 4 people together and stand inside it. It's so remarkable. And I think that one is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 200 as well.
Wow, that sounds one that's worth visiting for sure.
Yeah.
David, we got a question for you. Have you searched for lost apples south of Whitman County in Garfield or Azotin counties, or north of Spokane County? And what have you found?
Okay, let's see. As far as south of Whitman County, yes, we've found quite a number of trees outside of Waitsburg, and I think at least 1 or 2 outside of Dayton. north of Spokane County, we have not found anything, although there is we found the Shackelford in Spokane County, and Casimir Holinsky he found a elkhorn in northern Idaho just within the last year. And let's see, those are all areas that we go to. I would say to north of Spokane, less than the other areas, but down by Walla Walla, Dayton, and Waitsburg, south of Whitman County, yes, we regularly go down there and have found quite a few lost varieties down there.
Excellent. John, do you find that the longer living trees tend to be more tip bearing as opposed to spur forming?
I will have to say I don't know. I have not. But that's a very good question, and I will start to look more to see if that's the case. It would be interesting if that was the case, but I don't know.
All right. Yeah. Let's see. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I think I'm just going to push on with questions here. And if you have to take off, you certainly can. But we'll try and get through all of these. Let's see. We have a question from Jenny. She says there's tons of red apples with red stripes. How do you distinguish between varieties when they all look the same? I know it's based on color, but there's so many. How do you weed them out?
I'll let John tell you that. He's the apple D expert.
Well, what I used to do, and I still do this, but especially early on, is when someone identified an apple for me, and I knew, and I was convinced it was correct, I would take the apple and I would put it in the cup holder on my truck and stare at it when I was at a red light. I'd put it above my sink in the counter and stare at while I was doing the dishes. I'd stare and stare and stare and stare. When I like to use musical analogies, and my guess is if you have a favorite guitar player like, say, I don't know, Eric Clapton, if you hear two notes of Eric Clapton on the radio, you know instantly it's Eric Clapton. I wouldn't know it was Eric Clapton, but you do. Why do you know that? It is it's familiarity. Even subtleness is actually blatant if you know it well enough. So you have to see the subtleties in those red apples as being not subtle at all. And with red striped apples in particular, but really with any apple when you're identifying. So some, you may have 5 different varieties that are red blushed and red striped, but then you look at the calyx. Is the calyx open or closed? Or you cut it open and you look, is the core abaxile or axile? Are the stems always long, or are the stems variable? Is the cavity what we call acuminate or acute? So there are, that's where, as I was mentioning earlier, if you're going to get into identifying, you really do need to learn the parts of the apple, and then you need to learn what are the attributes of different varieties, and then you can begin to see that, yes, these two apples, both are red, blush, and striped or whatever, or they're both yellow and round. But if you look at them more closely, if you do like Sherlock says, you see, but you don't observe. If you learn to observe closely, then you'll begin to tell the difference between, one guitarist and the other, who to me might sound identical, but to you sound very obvious.
Do you have anything to add, David?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I am not an apple identification expert. That is a skill I have not acquired, and it's very rare. and very difficult to do.
All right, let's see. We got another question for John here. How do you think not having the Common Ground Agriculture Fair, such a communal event, will affect the amount of apple IDing you'll have to do this winter?
Well, that remains to be seen because the Apple ID season really has not begun. We're sort of it's just beginning. I don't know. It was a tough year for apples in central Maine. We had on our farm, we had 26 degrees during full bloom, which put the kibosh on a lot of the trees. So I think it's going to be a light year, which will, make it a little easier. But I hope we're organizing. I'm organizing with friends, other volunteers, to be able to handle the apples that people want to have identified, and we really hope that they will. So,
excellent. Let's see, get through some more questions here. Does it seem like, let's see, do summer apples survive better since they aren't putting resources into fruit development as much of the growing season?
what do you mean? What does that mean?
Let's see, could we get any clarification from Joshua? Wondering if the summer apples survive better than the fall bearing apples.
Survive in terms of their keeping
I think
quality?
length of their age,
Their lifespan, maybe.
their lifespan.
Oh.
I haven't noticed any difference. The main, for the apples that we look at, it seems the main issues of survival is just where they're planted. They're planted like at the bottom of a ravine in really good soil on the north side of a hill. Those apples are going to be doing much better than or a source of water. I know one tree that we found last year that I do not believe two people could have touched their hands around the tree, maybe three. And it was right next to a little stream. And that apple tree was extremely healthy.
One thing about that, about the old trees, is that frequently people ask me, well, should I just cut it down and plant a new one? And I say, no, just prune it. Often the old varieties, the old trees will do really well with just a pruning. That triggers the action for them to resprout. And I've seen trees, well, like that black Oxford that I was talking about in Hollowell, which, by the way, is a winter variety, that are very old, broken down, hollow, the top's gone, and yet coming out of the side of this beautiful young wood that's producing really nice fruit. So, so prune them. They like to be pruned.
Excellent. All right. Do either of you know of anybody that's doing any lost apple work in the South where there's low chill requirement varieties? It sounds like most of the work is being done in some of the northern climates.
No, I'm not aware of anybody down south doing any work like that.
Well, if you call, depending on your definition of South, but of course, Lee Calhoun did a huge amount, and his orchard, his preservation orchard, still exists. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of it now, but people can find it. Also, Tom Brown, who is a fruit explorer in North Carolina. I believe he's in North Carolina. He's doing a lot. I think if you, depending on where you are, I think if you poke around, you may be able to find people. There is a rich apple tradition going all the way down into Georgia and Alabama. There are varieties that, and I'm by no means an expert in Southern apples, but but there certainly is a rich tradition of growing apples down there.
All right, let's see. John, you've mentioned that a lot of these older varieties were specifically grown for non-raw eating purposes. Are there any other types of preservations or preparations with apples that you wished were more available today?
In terms of
Culinary uses?
well, there are a few good cookbooks that are attempting to resurrect different ways of using apples, of cooking apples. There are also some, occasionally you can find excellent articles in old ag yearbooks about different ways of using apples. A few years ago, our interns on our farm made apple molasses, which you make using sweet apples. Sweet apples are, if you look through any book on apples or old catalogs, you'll find different varieties: Tolman sweet, pound sweet, pumpkin sweet, Ramsdale sweet, etc. That when they have that word in the name sweet, it means that they are very low in acidity. If you press those apples, make them into cider, don't ferment them, just make them into fresh cider, then boil that down, you wind up with molasses that is indistinguishable from sugarcane molasses. It's delicious, and is very shelf stable. You could keep it for years. That's how they got their sugar source years ago when they didn't have access to cane sugar. So that's one way you could do it. We bake a lot of apples, which is really fun to do. The two of our favorite baking apples are Wolf River and Blue Pear, Maine, both of which their skin stays intact. So you wind up with an apple that's cooked on the inside, but still whole, so to speak. I think if you poke around, you can find really fun old recipes and then just experiment.
Excellent. Well, I think that is going to wrap us up for our first webinar of the series.
Kyle, can I interject here?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
That apple butter or molasses that John was talking about, we have a relationship with an orchard just over the border in Idaho, Athol Orchards, and they actually make that apple butter, and it's wonderful.
Excellent. All right, so this recording will be posted to our website in the next few days. So definitely spread the word to anybody that wasn't able to attend the live webinar today. Next month, we'll have an interesting webinar presented by Dr. Gail Volk. She's a plant physiologist at the National Laboratory for Genetic Research Preservation in Fort Collins, Colorado. And she's going to be discussing heritage apple identification using genetic fingerprinting. And that discussion is going to be moderated by Dr. Cameron Peace of Washington State University. Thank you all for attending, and be sure to let everyone know it's not too late to sign up for the rest of our webinars in this series. And we will see you guys all next month, September 16th at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. Now get out there and find some apples.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone.